The room was dimly lit, and the soft glow from the lamp cast long shadows on the walls. I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and conversations drifting up from the living room where my brother Jack and a few of his friends were hanging out. It was my first night visiting him at his off-campus apartment, and although I had come to see Jack, my attention was elsewhere. I hadn't expected Ryan, Jack's roommate and best friend, to catch my eye. I had seen him only a few times before, back when I would visit my brother during breaks. Ryan was quiet, reserved, and had a mysterious air about him that I found intriguing. There was something about the way he carried himself, always just a bit aloof, always keeping his distance, that made me want to know more. But tonight, as our eyes met across the crowded living room, there was a spark, a hint of something unspoken. I felt it, and I was certain he did too, even if he was trying to ignore it. It all began a few days earlier, when I arrived at my brother's apartment to stay for a week. I was on a break from school, and Jack had insisted I visit to get away for a bit. The plan was for us to catch up and for him to show me around campus. I had never imagined that Ryan would be here too, much less that he would stir up feelings in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. From the moment I saw him, I sensed that something was different. He wasn't the same carefree guy I remembered. There was a heaviness in his eyes, a kind of sadness that I couldn't quite place. I found out later from Jack that Ryan had gone through a rough breakup a few months back. His ex had left him, and from what Jack said, it was bad. Really bad. Apparently, Ryan hadn't been himself ever since. So when I noticed the way he avoided my gaze or made excuses to stay out of my way, I figured it was just because he didn't want to get close to anyone. But as the days passed, I couldn't help myself. I became more curious, more drawn to him, and I began to test the waters. It started innocently enough, lingering a bit longer in the kitchen when he was there, sitting next to him on the couch during movie night, finding little excuses to talk to him about anything and everything. At first, he was distant and polite, always keeping things casual, but I could see the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. There was something there, just beneath the surface, and I was determined to bring it out. Jack had gone out for the evening with some friends, and Ryan and I were left alone in the apartment. We hadn't spoken much that day, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air. I found him sitting in the living room, flipping through a book, and without thinking, I sat down beside him closer than I should have. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, but he didn't move away. "You know," I began, my voice softer than I intended, "I've always thought you were a kind of a mystery." Ryan's brow furrowed slightly. "A mystery?" he echoed, his tone weary. "Yes," I said, shifting closer. "Like there's a lot more to you than you let on, but you keep everyone at arm's length." He gave a small dry laugh. "Isn't that what people do when they don't want to get hurt?" His words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of sympathy for him. "Not everyone," I whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. Ryan stiffened, glancing down at our hands as if debating whether to pull away. When he didn't, I leaned in closer, feeling the electric charge that seemed to pass between us. For a moment, I thought he might give in, but then, just as quickly, he stood up, breaking the contact. "I can't do this," he said, his voice tense. "You're Jack's sister." The rejection stung, but I wasn't about to give up. And what if I wasn't? I challenged, standing up and facing him. Would that change things? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just that. I'm not ready for anything like this. Not after." He cut himself off, as though he had said too much. I took a step closer, refusing to back down. "Ryan, I know you're still hurting, but you can't close yourself off forever." The look in his eyes shifted. There was a flash of something there, something raw and vulnerable. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, "and I don't want to betray Jack." "You won't," I whispered, closing the distance between us once more. I reached up to touch his face, and this time he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, and before either of us could think twice, our lips met in a tentative kiss. It was a moment of weakness, of surrender. We both knew it was dangerous, but neither of us seemed to care. The first time, the kiss deepened slowly, as if we were both testing the waters, afraid to break the fragile moment we had found ourselves in. I felt the heat of his body as I pressed closer, my hands sliding up his back, pulling him to me. His touch was gentle, but filled with a restrained intensity, as though he was still holding back, even as we gave in to the attraction that had been shimmering for so long. The warmth of his breath brushed my cheek as he whispered my name, and a shiver of desire coursed through me. He moved his hands to my waist, then slid them up to cup my face, his touch sending tingles down my spine. I leaned into him, our bodies fitting together as if they were made for this moment. We sank back onto the couch, the world outside fading into nothingness. His lips traveled down to my neck, igniting every nerve in my body. The tension that had been building between us seemed to dissolve, replaced by a rush of exhilaration, and I was lost in him, in us, in the feeling that everything we were doing was inevitable. For a long time, there was nothing else but the rhythm of our breathing, the quiet gasp, and the sensation of being fully alive. It was reckless and dangerous, but it felt like exactly what I needed, what we both needed. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and dazed, I knew that we had crossed the line, that things would never be the same. But in that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to stay close to him, feeling his heartbeat steadying under my fingertips. The day that followed were a mix of exhilaration and guilt. When Jack was around, Ryan and I kept our distance, acting as if nothing had changed. But when we were alone, everything was different. The walls between us had crumbled, and the connection I had sensed between us was impossible to ignore. One evening, Jack came home earlier than expected and caught us talking in the hallway, standing a little too close. His expression darkened, and I could see the suspicion in his eyes. "What's going on there?" he asked, his voice edged with distrust. "Nothing," I said quickly, but my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. Ryan stepped back, his face a mask of calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "We were just talking," he said, trying to sound casual. Jack's gaze shifted from me to Ryan and then back again. "Talking, huh?" He didn't believe us, and I knew it. "You'd better be careful," he added, looking directly at Ryan. "She's not just some girl." The warning was clear, and it left a bitter taste in my mouth. I was more than just his sister. I was a person with my own feelings, my own desires. And those desires had only grown stronger, even with Jack's disapproval hanging over us like a storm cloud. That night, I confronted Ryan in his room, my emotions finally spilling over. "Are you going to let him dictate your life?" I demanded, the frustration and longing in my voice impossible to mask. "I'm not some little girl who needs protecting." He sighed, looking at me with a mixture of regret and desire. "It's not just about him," he said. "It's about us, about what this could do to our friendship, to your family." I shook my head, stepping closer to him. "I don't care," I whispered fiercely. "I don't care about anything else but how I feel when I'm with you." Before he could say another word, I kissed him, pouring all my frustration, my longing, and my need into that kiss. And this time he didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, as though he had finally made his choice. The second time, the urgency was different. As soon as I kissed him, all the frustration and longing seemed to pour out of me. He responded with an intensity I hadn't felt before, his hands moving to my waist and pulling me close as we stumbled backward toward the bed. Our lips never parted, even as we sank onto the mattress, his weight pressing me down in a way that felt both thrilling and comforting. His touch was sure now, no longer hesitant, as though he had finally let go of all the doubts that had held him back. His hand slid down my sides, tracing the curve of my body, and I felt a rush of warmth as his fingers found mine, interlacing them above my head. There was a tenderness to the way he looked at me, even as his breathing quickened and his movements grew more urgent. I arced into him, savoring the feel of his touch, the way his lips brushed over my shoulder, trailing his across my skin. Everything felt like it had been building to this moment, and as we moved together, I was lost in the sensation of being wanted, truly wanted. Afterward, we lay there in the quiet, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. Ryan's arm was draped over me, and for a moment, there was a calmness that settled over us, as though we were both content to just exist in that space. But even then, I could feel the weight of what had happened, the unspoken truth that this was not just a fleeting moment, but the beginning of something we couldn't turn back from. As we stood there, entangled in a moment that was both right and wrong, I knew we were crossing a line from which there would be no return. It was reckless, maybe even selfish, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive, and I wasn't going to let that feeling slip away. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The road ahead would be complicated, but I was ready to face it no matter what the cost. Because in that moment, I knew that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything.